Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Welcome to our brand new podcast, Where There's a Will, the show that explores true stories of family and fortune. I'm your host, Anthony Marrone. Please go ahead and leave me a comment and let me know you're here, and let me know if you are ready for
It's Britney, bitch.
our inaugural episode of the podcast, which is going to focus on Britney Spears. Today we're going to talk about all of the legal issues surrounding the Britney Spears conservatorship. We'll discuss the ins and outs of what's happened with Britney and the hashtag Free Britney movement. And if you stick around to the very end, we're going to have a special surprise for all of the listeners. Just a quick programming note on the structure of what we're doing. So this is a brand new podcast. Today is the first episode. And the idea is there's going to be a live and interactive video portion that you're seeing now that we're going to live stream over Facebook. And for the first 5 or 10 minutes, we'll take comments and kind of have some fun here while we get set up. And then you'll notice that there will be a short break where I will intro the audio podcast, and that's where I'll get into the actual podcast. You could keep watching. Please keep watching on video. I'll still take comments and questions along the way, but that's the audio portion that we're going to record and release on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. So it's going to be both a live video we're thinking every other Friday at this point, and then also if you can't catch it live, you can always watch the replay on YouTube, or the audio is going to be available separately on Apple and Spotify podcasts. So drop me a note. Let me know you're here. Thanks to everybody watching. We're going to get ready in a minute for the podcast version of Where There's a Will, the show that explores true stories of family and fortune. Episode 1 is focusing on the conservatorship for Britney Spears. So we're going to move into the podcast portion. Feel free to leave your comments or questions. Hello and welcome to Where There's a Will, the show that focuses on true stories of family and fortune. I am your host, Anthony Marrone, and today for this episode we're going to talk about the legal issues surrounding the Britney Spears conservatorship. We'll discuss the ins and outs of what's happened with Britney and the Free Britney movement, and if you stick around to the end, we're going to offer listeners a very special surprise. So I wanted to get started with today's episode, which is our first episode. So if you're listening, you are an early adopter of the podcast. The idea is that we're going to cover in each episode a real life tale, probably focusing mostly on people that you would know, that you've read about, on struggles that they've had, that all relate to the work that I do as an estate planning attorney. So a lot of my practice focuses on people's estates, their wills, doing guardianship for adults, which is the topic for today. But we're going to try to make it interesting and keep it fun by focusing, primarily on celebrities, but then we'll also talk about the real life application. I did this way back early in the pandemic. You might remember with Tiger King, where I did a deep dive into the estate proceedings and all the fights that they had on Tiger King, which was the Netflix show early in the pandemic, which feels like a lifetime ago. So we're kind of bringing it back. This stuff is always interesting to me, And with the Britney Spears documentary that premiered on Hulu this week, I think a lot of folks are talking about this. It's in the court system right now. There was a hearing yesterday that we're going to talk about. So it seemed timely and appropriate. So why not launch our podcast? So the first question I think that will help kind of set the scene for what we're talking about is, what is conservatorship? In New York State, we don't have conservatorship. It's called guardianship, but it's essentially the same thing. So a conservatorship is where you have an incapacitated adult. So it's usually someone, typically, that is suffering from some kind of cognitive decline, generally associated with dementia and Alzheimer's patients, but not exclusively. We have a lot of guardianship and conservatorship cases for people that suffer traumatic brain injuries later in life, or folks that become disabled later on in life. So not people that are born with a disability. Those are separate from what we're talking about today. In New York, this requires proof that the person's incapacitated by clear and convincing evidence. So this is a kind of inside baseball lawyer jargon, but the highest burden is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's criminal proof, right? That's how you prove that someone has committed a crime. The next level under that is clear and convincing evidence. So it's still a pretty high burden that you have to establish to show that someone is incapacitated and is in need of a conservatorship. This case originated and continues to go forward in the state of California. So state law is important here. Guardianships and conservatorships are different state by state. So what's true in New York State is not necessarily true in California, is not true in Texas. The state laws are all different on this topic. In California, in order to have a conservatorship, you have to have a deficit, what they call a deficit, in one of the 4 mental functions. And this is how they define it in the court system out there. Either alertness and attention, which is really 2 mental functions, but they call that 1 function. So alertness and attention, information processing, thought processing, and the ability to modulate your mood. Now, it's important to note that this has to be a deficit in your functioning, not just an isolated incident. So we've all probably been through things in our life where any number of these mental functions may have been called into question on a temporary basis. But it's really about establishing a consistent pattern where your deficit in any of these 4 areas permanently impacts your mental functioning. Okay, so how does this all work out with Britney Spears? In 2008, right, so 13 years ago, there was some things going on in her life, and Britney Spears twice was involuntarily committed or placed in a psychiatric facility. So she was going through stuff in her personal life. 2 times she ends up in a psychiatric hospital. And after the second placement, her dad, Jamie Spears, applies for what they called at the time a temporary conservatorship. So this would be a temporary management of her affairs. Obviously, it hasn't been temporary because it's gone on for 13 years now, but at the time, the application that they made was for temporary conservatorship. One of the things that's interesting from my perspective is that I will say, in New York, it is very, very difficult to obtain guardianship or conservatorship over a younger person. Not someone, disregarding someone who's born perhaps with a developmental disability, but someone who's in their 20s, as Britney was in 2008, and is perhaps making some poor life decisions. I don't think anyone would doubt that at the time, that some of her behavior was not what you'd call responsible adult behavior, especially for someone with children, little kids. But to obtain conservatorship or guardianship over someone of her caliber in terms of, performance and recording new music and touring and all the things she's done, just extremely rare. And I think that's probably one reason why this case is catching more and more attention, is it just doesn't seem right that you've got, regardless of what you think about her lifestyle choices, a person who's performing at a very high level, very creative, did a 4-year residency in Las Vegas, has put out multiple albums in the past decade, multi-platinum recording artist, and also is in need of constant court supervision. Those two things, it's hard to reconcile. So, and I really think in New York State, in the cases that I've done, and I've been involved in hundreds of these, very rare that you get a young person. And when there is an allegation of underlying mental health issues, that doesn't make it any easier to get guardianship in New York. I mean, frankly, it makes it a little bit more challenging because one of the things that is brought up constantly in cases like that is that these underlying mental health conditions are treatable with a combination of therapy and medicine and whatever the doctors say is needed to treat it. And after treating those, this person is not going to be completely incapacitated anymore. So it's hard to get guardianship or conservatorship in a situation, even the situation that Britney was in 2008. But at the time, the judge does appoint conservators for her. And you've got an interesting thing that happened. Her dad, who in this documentary is just nowhere before she needed the conservatorship. He seemed like he was kind of on the outside, not really, he had substance abuse problems, couldn't hold a job, just probably was not as involved as the mom appeared to be, according to the documentary. But Dad resurfaces, Dad's back in the picture, and he gets appointed as what's called co-conservator, meaning he's going to share the responsibility with someone. And the person who was named at the time was a private attorney by the name of Andrew Wallet in California, in Los Angeles. One little interesting thing that comes up a lot, or comes up sometimes in these types of cases, is at the time in 2008, and if you watch in the documentary, they interview this lawyer. But at the time in 2008, the lawyer that Britney tried to hire to fight the conservatorship, the judge actually would not allow him to represent her. So one thing that typically happens is when you're applying for conservatorship over someone, the judge who's in charge of that case, who gets assigned that case, will typically appoint a lawyer to represent the person like Britney, right? They'll appoint a lawyer to represent what we call the alleged incapacitated person, to protect their rights and advocate for them. Now, there is a provision in New York State law that says if they want to hire their own lawyer, if the alleged incapacitated person wants to hire their own counsel, they're free to do it. What happened in this case is that lawyer who Britney tried to hire showed up to court in 2008, and they interview him in the documentary. And the judge says, no, I find that she doesn't have capacity to hire you, meaning she doesn't have the underlying legal capacity to make the decision to consent to hire you in the first place. So you are not going to be her lawyer. And this gentleman has apparently a ton of experience doing these types of cases, and he clearly disgruntled in the interview. But the judge appoints a separate lawyer to represent her, and he has represented her consistently for the past 13 years. So we get co-conservator, Dad, and this other lawyer, 2008, and everything kind of recedes into the background. And for a while, Britney goes back to work. She puts out some additional great music. And we can't play the whole song for copyright reasons. But she puts out more music. She keeps touring. She does a 4-year stint in Vegas. And then we get to fast forward to 2019. And if you have questions along the way, it's probably a good time to mention we are simulcasting this as a live video broadcast. So if you're listening to the audio replay, thank you. But you can also, if you follow us on Facebook, you'll be able to join in live for the next stream. So if you are watching live and you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them, and we'll try to work them in throughout the show. Okay, so fast forward to 2019. Britney's dad suffers some health conditions. So he's going through some personal health issues. And Britney was supposed to do another stint in a different hotel at Las Vegas. She all of a sudden says she can't do that because she has to take care of her dad and pay attention to her family, which is fine. But then some weird things happen that are really unexplained. Jamie Spears, the dad, resigns as guardian of the person or conservator of the person. So one thing to know about the way that these work, both in New York and California, is that there's essentially two different ways that you can be someone's conservator. There's what's called conservator of the person, which is going to apply to making personal and healthcare decisions for someone, where they should live, where they should receive medical treatment, who they're allowed to be in contact with, whether they can drive, whether they can have a license, whether they can vote, whether they can get married. That's conservator of the person. Conservator of the property, or as it's called in California, conservator of the estate, deals with financial matters, right? Paying bills, taxes. In the case of Britney Spears, it's managing her career and all of her property interests and holdings. So you've got two separate duties. Dad resigns in 2019, says he's sick, he can't devote all the attention to it. So he resigns as guardian of the or conservator of the person, but not as conservator of the property. So he sticks on to deal with the money, but not making Britney's personal, decisions about her social life and where she should live. The judge appoints a new lawyer, Jody Montgomery, as temporary for the person, temporary conservator for the person. That's in 2019, and actually she was just re-upped. Jody Montgomery, the lawyer, was just reappointed, so she'll serve through at least September 2021. There doesn't appear to be any objection by Britney or her lawyer to this Jody Montgomery, who's apparently a reputable estate lawyer in California. Doesn't appear to be any objection to her managing the person. And that makes sense because a lot of the court filings that Britney and her lawyer have made are to try to kind of push the dad out. So keeping the dad out and having this Jody Montgomery attorney manage personal decisions for Britney, I think it does appear that she seems to be okay with that. So another maneuver in terms of what Britney and her lawyer have been trying to do to get dad out of the way is to get what we call a professional fiduciary. So most banks have trust management departments that their entire job is managing investments for people. So, not like the bank you go in and you make a deposit. In the back office or upstairs, there are groups of people who specialize in growing investments and managing those investments. So Britney wanted, through her lawyer, to get this Bessemer Trust, which is a financial institution, appointed to manage her financial affairs. The judge at the time last year didn't want to remove Jamie from doing that completely, so he appoints Bessemer Trust as co-conservator with the dad. Now, in my experience, these co-fiduciary or co-conservator appointments can go a couple different ways. Sometimes they go great when you work well with someone, and then sometimes if you can't work with the person or you have different interests in terms of managing the property for someone, it can be really tricky. Pretty much immediately they were back in court because the dad was trying to exclude Bessemer Trust from making any financial decisions. So they were fighting and haggling over that. That's what brought them back to court yesterday as well. So they were in court on Thursday, February 11th in Los Angeles, virtual court, as it were, as we're doing almost everywhere now. And the fight was over how much authority Bessemer Trust has versus how much authority the dad has to help manage Britney's affairs. So yesterday was a lot of kind of legal wrangling, behind the scenes minutia. No major changes in terms of ending or looking to end the conservatorship for Britney. The conservatorship right now, they say that there's assets of about $60 million in it, which, she at one point was making, I think, grossing $1 million a week when she was in Las Vegas. So the one thing to note is that that's not the extent of her assets. That's just what the conservator's managing. There have been some filings that show that she has trusts that are managed by other individuals or entities that are not included in the conservatorship. So she's likely got other assets beyond the scope of the $60 million, but at least $60 million is what we're dealing with in the conservatorship itself. Out of that, Britney gets an allowance, but they've also got to pay the dad. Now they've got to pay Bessemer Trust Company, plus the lawyers for all these people. Britney's paying for all of this. So that's why, one of the interesting things in the documentary is this Free Britney movement, which is a thing on Twitter, but it's also real life people going to the courthouse to protest that, this woman is an upright individual. She's clearly, even if she's had some issues in the past, who hasn't? She's performing at a high level. She's making music. She's touring. She's, in Las Vegas, performing every week. That's not someone who should be under a conservatorship. The way that these laws are designed are not for people like Britney Spears. It's just clearly not. She may need help managing finances and managing her business, which most mega celebrities do have that help anyways. So, but she should be allowed to direct that on her own, not have to go through her dad or go through some court system. That, I think, is the important thing to keep in mind. One thing that stuck with me, which I believe to be true, is that if Britney Spears was a man in this country, this never would have happened. And I almost undoubtedly believe that to be true. It's absurdly rare, I think, that you'd have this in the first place for someone so young and so prolific and talented. These laws are designed for people who are suffering permanent cognitive decline or temporary, and then it should end at a point. And I think that's the big question is, the idea was that it was going to be temporary in 2008, but realistically, we're 13 years on. So it's definitely not been temporary. And the question that I think a lot of folks have is, what is the plan to wrap it up? Clearly she can't be performing at this high level and doing all of these things and be at the same time so incompetent or incapacitated that she requires this court supervision. It's just those two things, it's hard to reconcile. So still going on. They've scheduled a few more court dates for April and May of this year. Hard to say because a lot of the stuff is filed under seal, which means I can't review the actual document themselves. So it's hard to say exactly what is going to be discussed at those later court dates, but there was a lot of wrangling yesterday by the lawyers for Bessemer Trust Company and the dad fighting over who's going to have financial decision authority. And the judge said, you share it, so you've got to work this out between the two of you. It does seem to be going in the trend where they're potentially pushing the dad out, which seems to be what Britney wants. But again, the conservators have restricted access to her in a way that she's not giving interviews or transparent about what her wishes are. So it's really hard to tell what she wants. We know that last year, in a filing by her lawyer, she said the conservatorship was voluntary. So there was a court filing where her lawyer said, no, this is voluntary. She goes along with this. It's tough to say if she made that choice freely and willingly, or if it's her lawyer kind of coaching her that that's the way to get this thing going in the direction you want and maybe help us push dad out, go along to get along type thing. Tough to say because, again, you haven't really had access to the person to ask her the questions, but they're all good questions. I think the overarching theme for me as someone who does a lot of this type of work is it's very rare that you will see this for someone so young and not suffering from an ongoing incapacity. She may have ongoing underlying mental health issues. No one knows that but her and her family and her doctors. But that doesn't mean that you have to be under court supervision and under a guardianship. She's broken no laws. This is not a criminal thing. This is a civil issue. So very irregular, I think, to have this kind of case. Nevertheless, that's where we are. Feel free, if you have any questions or comments, to leave them. If you're watching a live feed, feel free to leave them. If you're listening to a podcast, you can always email me at anthony@themarronelawfirm.com. And I appreciate you tuning in to the first episode of Where There's a Will, the show that explores true stories of family and fortune. We're going to continue to talk about legal issues surrounding inheritance, guardianships. We will follow the Britney Spears story, so if there's an update, I will bring it to you. And I promised that there would be a bonus if you stuck around to the end. So if you're one of the folks that stuck around to the end and you share this video or share this podcast and tag me or tag my law firm, you're going to get a bonus entry to our Peloton giveaway. So we're giving away a Peloton on Monday through the Marrone Law Firm. And if you share this video or share the podcast on social media and tag me, either me or the firm, Marrone Elder Law, you'll get a bonus giveaway entry. So thank you all for being here. And until next time, I am Anthony Marrone, and this is Where There's a Will.